90,000 dams were constructed across the United States throughout the 20th century. These massive concrete barriers illuminated entire cities with hydroelectric power, provided consistent irrigation for millions of acres of farmland, and served as the structural backbone for a surging national economy. Why did such a monumental feat of engineering lead to the collapse of local biological systems? The answer lies in the total obstruction of vital migratory paths. On the Elwha River, which historically supported a population of more than 400,000 salmon every year, the installation of two massive dams completely severed the natural flow of the waterway. The river was effectively transformed into a stagnant and dead ecosystem. For decades, the Elwha was viewed as a lost cause by a nation that routinely spends billions of dollars on various environmental conservation efforts. But in reality, the damage was not irreversible. The United States government eventually reached a rare and historic decision to dismantle the very structures it had painstakingly built and return the entire river to its original unimpeded state. One can notice how the concrete barriers were slowly chipped away by hydraulic machinery until the water finally broke through the final obstructions. But this is just the beginning. It only looks obvious that nature would recover, but the speed of the transformation caught many by surprise. Just a few years after the final demolition phases were completed, a remarkable phenomenon occurred within the riverbed. Salmon began to reappear in remote stretches of the water where they had been absent for multiple human generations. One can notice the fish leaping through the currents as the sediment-laden water gradually clears. It is visible how the riverbanks are beginning to stabilize with new vegetation as the nutrients from the ocean are once again deposited upstream. The process is only gaining momentum. Automated sensors and field researchers now track the movement of these resilient populations as they navigate the restored channels. Everything only gets more complicated when analyzing the genetic memory of these species. How were the salmon able to rediscover specific migration paths that their ancestors had been forced to abandon nearly a century ago? The restoration of the Elwha River provides a unique technical case study in how a complex ecosystem can be revived through the total removal of industrial interference. The water continues its steady journey toward the sea, carving new paths through the valley as the environment stabilizes. 400,000 Pacific salmon migrated annually through the Elwha River before any industrial interference occurred. This volume of biomass created one of the most resilient ecosystems across the entire west coast of the United States. Why did such a massive population thrive in this specific waterway? The answer lies in the 70 miles of pristine riverbed winding through the ancient old-growth forests of Olympic National Park in northwestern Washington. But this is just the beginning. One can notice how the river channel was once filled with complex side channels and massive woody debris. These natural obstructions created sheltered zones where gravel could accumulate. It is visible how juvenile salmon utilize these intricate habitats to find protection and grow before their journey to the ocean. Chinook, coho, sockeye, pink, and chum salmon all participated in these massive upstream migrations to spawn. Some individual Elwha Chinook reached staggering proportions, weighing more than 45 kilograms. These specimens were among the largest salmon ever recorded in biological history. At first glance, the river was a source of food, but in reality, it functioned as the living axis for the lower Elwha Klamath people for thousands of years. The process is only gaining momentum. Nutrients traveled from the depths of the ocean back into the heart of the forest. Every spawning season, the carcasses of salmon that expired after laying their eggs deposited vital minerals into the environment. This biological transfer included significant amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. Scientists determined through later studies that 20 to 25% of the nitrogen found in riparian vegetation originated directly from these salmon. One can notice the physical cycle of nature as these elements moved from the water into the towering trees and local wildlife. It gets more complex further on. The river system maintained a delicate chemical balance through this constant influx of marine-derived nutrients. The camera glides along the historical banks where the forest floor absorbed the remains of the migration. This nutrient exchange ensured the continued health of the entire watershed and the species that depended on it. Thus, The ecosystem operated as a self-sustaining cycle of growth and renewal. 100 years of industrial presence began with the construction of two massive hydroelectric barriers on the Elwha River during the early 20th century. Why were these specific locations chosen for such transformative infrastructure? The first structure, known as the Elwha Dam, reached completion in 1913 near the mouth of the river, situated only a few kilometers from the open ocean. 14 years later, in 1927, the Glens Canyon Dam was finished much further upstream, anchored deep within the narrow confines of a precipitous canyon. Both facilities were engineered to generate electricity for the regional paper mills, sawmills, and the expanding settlement of Port Angeles. The dams lacked fish passage mechanisms entirely. At first glance, this omission seems like a catastrophic oversight. But in reality, the ecological sciences were in their absolute infancy during this era of rapid industrialization. Salmon populations were not categorized as a technical priority in the design of American infrastructure at that time. One can notice how the sheer rock walls of Glens Canyon create a vertical environment that made the installation of ladders technically impossible with the engineering capabilities of the early 20th century. The process of environmental isolation only gained momentum as the decades passed. Even when Washington State eventually implemented legal requirements for fish ladders, both Elwha structures were granted specific exemptions and remained exactly as they were built. Within a few short years of becoming fully operational, over 70 miles of upstream habitat were severed from the ocean. This area contained the vast majority of the river system's natural spawning grounds. Migratory runs that once consisted of hundreds of thousands of individual fish were suddenly blocked by concrete walls. It is visible how the lack of access caused population numbers to plummet from several 100,000 to only a few thousand per year by the late 20th century. But this is just the beginning of the environmental shift. The absence of fish triggered a massive cascade of physical and biological changes throughout the entire riparian corridor. Marine-derived nutrients, once deposited by dying salmon, were no longer transported back into the surrounding forests by predators. The river channel itself grew structurally simpler, losing the large woody debris and natural sediment disturbances that characterize a healthy waterway. Everything only gets more complicated as the food web collapses. Birds and mammalian predators became significantly scarcer as the primary food source vanished from the water. The equipment of the natural world, from the soil chemistry to the forest canopy, began to drift away from its original equilibrium. One can notice the silence in the upstream canyons, where the rhythm of the salmon life cycle once dominated the environment. For nearly a century, the water of the Elwha River continued to move toward the sea. But the biological engine that had once defined its vitality remained broken. The system functioned in a state of artificial stasis, waiting for a transition to the next level of restoration. Thus, the river remained a fragmented shadow of its former self for decades. 100 years of industrial presence on the Elwha River reached a critical tipping point as the benefits provided by the two aging dams dwindled against the scale of environmental loss. Why did the United States government choose the radical path of total demolition over simple modernization? The structures were nearing the end of their operational lifespan, characterized by low power generation efficiency and maintenance costs that climbed higher with every passing year. At first glance, the dams appeared to be permanent fixtures of the landscape. But in reality, their location within Olympic National Park shifted the legal and ethical balance toward ecosystem conservation over industrial utility. This transition from exploitation to restoration required decades of intense negotiations involving scientists, government agencies, and the lower Elwha Klamath tribe. Congress passed the Elwha River Ecosystem and Fisheries Restoration Act in 1992 to formalize a goal that went beyond merely bringing back salmon. The mandate sought to return the entire river ecosystem to a state as close to its natural pre-industrial condition as physically possible. The process is only gaining momentum at this stage, but this choice introduced a massive technical challenge involving 20 million cubic meters of sediment trapped behind the concrete walls for nearly an entire century. One can notice how the sheer volume of silt and debris threatened to cloud the water and fundamentally reshape the river mouth once the barriers were gone. Removing such massive infrastructure could potentially devastate nearshore marine life or fail to trigger the return of the fish populations at all. Despite these risks and the surrounding controversy, the actual dismantling of the structures officially began in the year 2011. It is visible how hydraulic machinery and controlled demolition techniques started the largest dam removal project in the history of the United States. The engineering scale was unprecedented, yet the underlying vision was even more significant. For the first time, a deliberate decision was made to dismantle active infrastructure, specifically to restore the natural flow of a river system. The equipment gradually cleared the way for the water, marking a transition to a new era of environmental management. This shift represents a unique moment where human engineering was applied to undo its own previous footprint on the wilderness. The river began to reclaim its original path as the concrete obstacles were systematically reduced to rubble. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of ecological recovery without haste. 100 years, the duration for which the Elwha River remained divided before its final concrete barriers were finally dismantled. Why did the ecosystem react with such immediate precision to the removal of the dams? It would seem that a century of blockage would erase the biological memory of the river, but in reality, the aquatic life cycle proved to be dormant rather than destroyed. The restoration was not marked by a formal ribbon-cutting ceremony or public fanfare, but by the physical reconnection of the Olympic Mountains to the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Water began to flow along its historical path as the last sections of the dams disappeared. One can notice how the current regained its natural velocity, carving through silt and debris that had accumulated for decades. But this is just the beginning. Management agencies initiated a specific jumpstart strategy by releasing a limited number of juvenile and adult salmon into the upper reaches of the watershed. These releases were strictly small in scale and served as a localized support measure rather than a massive, permanent hatchery-based restoration program. The camera glides along the newly opened river reaches where, within just a few months, the first individual fish were documented navigating through sections of the riverbed that had been blocked for 90 years. Everything only gets more complicated as the seasonal cycles take hold. By the arrival of the following spawning seasons, the salmon began to appear on gravel beds that had remained barren of reproductive activity for generations. Scientific surveys confirmed a significant biological recovery as multiple species reclaimed the upper river territory. These included Chinook, coho, sockeye, and chum salmon, each finding their way into the high-altitude headwaters. It only looks obvious that they would return, but in reality, the speed of the recolonization exceeded most technical projections. Even more striking was the observation that some of the returning salmon did not originate from the river's historical local stocks. Instead, genetic data revealed they came from neighboring populations within the broader region. This biological phenomenon suggested that salmon do not rely exclusively on natal homing, but instead possess a highly flexible capacity to colonize new territories once natural conditions are restored. The process is only gaining momentum. One can notice how the gravel beds are now being reshaped by the movement of these fish as they prepare for spawning. The return was quiet and devoid of human interference, yet it remained a decisive victory for the local geography. After nearly 10 decades of total separation, the salmon life cycle was restored to its role as the fundamental structural element of the entire Elwha ecosystem. Transition to the next level. Thus, the river system returns to a state of equilibrium as the biological and geological components are finally reconnected. 100 years of biological isolation ended the moment the first salmon successfully navigated back to the upper reaches of the Elwha River. Why did this return signify more than just the arrival of a single species? It only looks obvious that the fish occupy the water, but in reality, their presence triggers a chemical transformation that saturates the entire valley. Marine-derived nutrients, specifically nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon, were carried upstream by the thousands and absorbed directly into the water, the surrounding soils, and the riparian vegetation. The process is only gaining momentum. Ecological studies conducted along the banks documented a rapid increase in aquatic insects within just a few years of the dam removals. These small organisms form the essential foundation of the river's food web. One can notice how the increased biomass supports larger predators, leading to the return of fish-eating birds and various riparian bird species in growing numbers. It gets more complex further on. Mammals such as river otters, black bears, and martens began appearing more frequently along the Elwha's banks to take advantage of the predictable seasonal food supply. The recovery extended far beyond the primary river channel. Scientists utilized precision equipment to detect salmon-derived nitrogen reappearing within the cellular structure of riverside trees. The equipment gradually confirms that the long-broken connection between the river and the forest is being restored. At first glance, the growth of trees seems independent of the water, but in reality, these nutrients allow vegetation to become more diverse and stable. Stronger root systems now anchor the soils with greater efficiency, which significantly reduces erosion and improves overall water quality. Everything only gets more complicated as the terrestrial and aquatic systems merge once again. One can notice how the forest canopy thickens as the nutrient cycle stabilizes across the landscape. The material exchange between the ocean and the mountains continues to rebuild the environment. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of ecological processing. 100 years of sediment trapped behind the barriers began their journey downstream as soon as the concrete walls were removed. Why did the revival of the Elwha River encounter such significant technical and biological hurdles during its initial phase? At first glance, the return of the salmon seemed like a purely positive indicator of ecological health, but the sudden influx of thousands of fish triggered a massive spike in nutrient levels following every spawning season. This is just the beginning of a long stabilization period. One can notice how the water chemistry shifts rapidly when organic matter decomposes in concentrated river reaches. The process of rebalancing the ecosystem is only gaining momentum. Dense concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus from the decaying salmon carcasses stimulated the aggressive growth of microorganisms and thick blankets of algae. As these organisms flourished and then died off, they consumed the available dissolved oxygen, creating seasonal deficits that stressed the very fish that had just returned to the basin. It only looks obvious that more nutrients would benefit the river, but in reality, the system required a much longer time frame to integrate these sudden biological loads without crashing. Vast quantities of silt and gravel that had been immobile for a century were suddenly released into the main channel. The camera glides along the river mouth, where the coastline is being physically reshaped by the discharge of millions of cubic meters of long-trapped sediment. During the early years of the project, the water remained consistently turbid as the fine particles stayed in suspension while moving toward the sea. This sediment pulse was not a singular event, but a continuous mechanical realignment of the riverbed. Everything only gets more complicated as the natural flow patterns interact with human interests. Fishermen expressed concerns that the returning salmon runs would become too dispersed across the new landscape, making traditional harvest methods less predictable. Meanwhile, environmental managers faced the difficult task of calculating the precise balance between protecting wild genetic strains and maintaining the output of hatchery support programs. It seems simple to just let nature take over, but the management of such a large-scale transition requires constant technical calibration. Restoration is not a final destination, but a heavy, multi-layered industrial and biological evolution. The Elwha did not instantly return to an idealized or pristine state the moment the dams disappeared. Like any complex system freed after decades of rigid hydraulic control, the river requires a significant amount of time to find its own equilibrium. It is visible how the landscape gradually adapts to the unhindered flow of water and nutrients. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of processing as the ecosystem continues its slow adjustment. 4 large dams across 2 different states constituted the massive industrial barrier that fragmented the Klamath River for the better part of a century. Why did the removal of these specific structures become the most complex environmental engineering decision in the history of the United States? The project was not a simple demolition, but a logistical operation involving dozens of local management agencies and multiple indigenous tribes. But in reality, the scale of coordination between Oregon and California was necessitated by the sheer biological importance of this single corridor. Indigenous communities and riparian ecosystems relied on the natural flow of the Klamath for thousands of years before the arrival of 20th-century hydroelectric projects. One can notice how the construction of these concrete walls fundamentally severed the migration paths of regional salmon populations. Hydroelectric dams were erected to harness the power of the water, but they simultaneously cut off fish from their essential upstream habitats. The process is only gaining momentum. Consequently, fish populations declined sharply, while the quality of the stagnant water behind the reservoirs began to deteriorate. Conflicting interest between hydropower companies, agricultural sectors, and conservation efforts intensified as the river system reached a breaking point. It seems simple to suggest technical upgrades, but in reality, adding fish ladders or retrofitting the existing structures was deemed insufficient for a total recovery. The ultimate solution mirrored the strategy used on the Elwha, focusing on the complete removal of the dams to facilitate a return to natural river dynamics. Everything only gets more complicated when dealing with a system of this magnitude. One can observe how the final dams were dismantled in the early 2020s, allowing the water to reclaim its original path. Salmon began returning to reaches of the river that had been entirely inaccessible for several decades. If the recovery of the Elwha served as a primary demonstration of how smaller river systems rebound, the Klamath proved that even heavily stressed large-scale systems can achieve restoration. The camera glides along the newly opened ecological corridors that now allow for the unobstructed movement of species. It does not end at this stage. The successful reopening of these paths ensures that the biological integrity of the river continues to strengthen. The water now flows through its ancient channels without any further mechanical obstruction. Thus ends one of the most significant chapters in the restoration of the western river systems. 4 large dams stand in succession along the lower reaches of the Snake River, marking a stark contrast to the free-flowing waters of the Elwha and Klamath. Why has salmon recovery on this specific waterway transitioned from a technical challenge into a decades-long national controversy? The river serves as a critical migration corridor for Chinook salmon and steelhead trout, winding through the arid interior of the American Pacific Northwest before merging with the Columbia River. But the presence of these massive concrete barriers fundamentally alters the natural rhythm of the migration. One can notice how the water slows and pools behind each of the 4 structures, which provide essential services to the surrounding states. These engineering marvels do not only block the path of fish, but they also generate significant amounts of electricity and support inland navigation for transport. Furthermore, they provide the irrigation necessary for large-scale agriculture and stabilize the economic livelihoods of a vast region. Consequently, each individual dam on the Snake River represents more than just a physical ecological barrier. It serves as a foundational economic and political pillar for the local population. It only looks obvious that the solution lies in mechanical assistance, yet the reality of biological survival is far more intricate. Over the course of many years, engineers and biologists have implemented a wide range of sophisticated mitigation measures to counteract the impact of the dams. These efforts include the construction of complex fish ladders and the process of barging young fish directly around the barriers to avoid the turbines. Flow management strategies are also employed, where the volume of water released is meticulously timed to support the natural movement of the salmon. The process is only gaining momentum as the environmental data becomes increasingly clear. Yet despite these extensive and costly efforts, the populations of salmon have continued their steady decline toward extinction. This persistent failure of mitigation has pushed the national debate to its core question regarding whether these 4 dams should be removed entirely. On the Snake River, such a question extends far beyond the survival of a single species. At first glance, it is a matter of ecology, but in reality, it involves a fundamental restructuring of regional energy production, agricultural stability, and food security. Transition to the next level of the debate occurs as stakeholders weigh the loss of jobs against the restoration of a collapsed ecosystem. This remains one of the most complex and hotly contested issues in the broader effort to restore the rivers and natural landscapes of the United States. The conflict over the Snake River continues to evolve as the search for a permanent solution persists. 3 distinct river systems, the Elwha, the Klamath, and the Snake, demonstrate that ecological restoration operates not as a predetermined formula, but as a complex sequence of difficult choices between industrial human requirements, and the requirements of the natural environment. Why does the recovery of these waterways require such calculated sacrifices? The process of restoration only looks obvious at first glance, but in reality, it involves weighing decades of infrastructure against the survival of aquatic species. These rivers share one fundamental truth that guides every technical decision made by engineers and biologists alike. Restoration is not a mechanism for turning back the chronological clock. Instead, the process focuses on creating the physical conditions that allow nature to adapt within a global landscape that has already undergone permanent changes. One can notice how the removal of concrete barriers allows sediment to flow downstream at a natural pace, settling into new layers on the riverbed. But this is just the beginning. The Elwha River system serves neither as a singular miracle nor as a final conclusion to the engineering challenge. It functions as physical proof that when human intervention recedes, the river finds its own path forward through the valley. The camera glides along the newly formed banks where the water carves unique channels through the silt and gravel. It is visible how the hydraulic force of the current reshapes the landscape without the need for manual guidance. Everything only gets more complicated when considering the thousands of other rivers still obstructed by aging infrastructure. The central technical question remains centered on the specific amount of physical space required for these ecosystems to function independently once again. Therefore, the focus shifts toward the long-term sustainability of allowing these natural systems to operate on their own. The material and environmental balance is maintained through the careful withdrawal of structural control. From here, the transformation moves to the next phase of observation as the water continues its descent toward the sea. Thus, the river reaches a state of self-regulation, concluding this stage of the restoration process.